My name is Graham West, and as I stepped through the gilded doors of Langford Hall, I felt the old tug of disbelief tighten around my chest. I wasn't supposed to be here. Officially, I had no claim on the guest list, no escort wristband, no name badge with sparkling script announcing my presence. Yet here I was, standing under crystal chandeliers and humming conversations, clutching a single invitation that bore someone else's embossed monogram. In the months since our divorce finalized, I had watched from the sidelines as Cassandra's life bloomed into glossy magazine spreads, philanthropic galas, five-star fundraisers, and headline-grabbing speeches delivered with a poised smile. Now, on this warm spring evening, her new husband's charity gala celebrated local excellence in business and philanthropy, a phrase so broad it could encompass anyone or no one at all. In fact, that vagueness was my passport in. No one recognized me until I chose to make them. I drifted past tables draped in ivory linen, past waiters balancing trays of champagne flutes that caught the light like strings of diamonds, and past clusters of women in couture gowns and men in tailored tuxedos who exchanged pleasantries and business cards with robotic enthusiasm. The air smelled of polished wood and roses, a fragrant staging ground for small talk and conspicuous giving. Hosts circulated with rehearsed charm, leaning in to greet neighbors they barely knew, their laughter riveted more to appearance than to amusement. I reminded myself of how it felt to arrive here once, years ago, as Cassandra's plus one, hand in hand, and promising her I was more than spreadsheets and office memos. She had called me her quiet backbone, then discarded that backbone the moment I showed signs of ambition. Tonight, I was anonymous again, a ghost haunting the halls I helped finance, a silent testament to everything they thought they understood. I paused at a mirrored wall engraved with donor names, rows of polished plaques commemorating contributions in neat alphabetical order. Beneath, Langford and Langford Enterprises gleamed a bright brass plate, Langford Family Foundation. I allowed myself a tiny, private smile. I had funded that foundation. Not anonymously, mind you. I had wired a generous check weeks ago. I had believed in Cassandra's vision once, long before I discovered that her vision had always been larger than me. Looking at my handiwork collected in her new legacy, I felt both vindicated and hollow, a clash of pride and resentment. A photographer snapped a candid just inches from my shoulder, capturing my reflection in the glass, and I almost turned away, fearful of exposure. But instead, I tilted my chin up, dropped my shoulders, and let the shiver settle. If I was a shadow in her spotlight, it was by my own design. Scanning the crowd, I spotted Cassandra herself radiating confidence at the center of a well-choreographed crowd. She laughed at a joke I couldn't hear, eyes lit with the kind of sparkle that used to warm me from the inside out. Her blonde curls shimmered like spun gold, the red of her gown glowing against her skin. She was beautiful, flawless, untouchable. I used to crave that laugh, that sparkle, until it became a weapon aimed at my insecurities. Tonight, she wielded it again, brandishing every bit of charm calculated to captivate reporters and board members. I stepped aside as she excused herself from one conversation to join another, plotting victories with every measured word. Her posture never faltered, her gaze never wavered. To the world, she had perfected the art of reinvention. Only I remembered who she once claimed I was, just a paper pusher, she'd said, then moved on to someone more deserving of her spotlight. It felt good to watch her settle into that same ballroom, unaware that the man she once belittled was already in the room, unrecognized and unafraid. I made my way through a group clustered around the stage where Travis Langford, her new husband, prepared to deliver opening remarks. He was a handsome, broad-shouldered man with a practiced smile and a voice engineered to exude warmth. Guests turned toward him, raising their glasses in acknowledgement. I trailed the edge of the circle, deliberately invisible, the plus one nobody noticed. Yet in that moment I tasted the sweetest irony. I had spent years working behind the scenes, refining algorithms and securing contracts that built the company she now flaunted as her own achievement. The night felt charged, like the calm before a storm you can't see but sense deep in your bones. I could feel every eye poised to shift, every conversation waiting for the right spark. And I held that spark in my mind, rehearsing the single word that would alter the current of polite chatter. Founder. I positioned myself at the back, conveniently close enough to catch the hush when Travis gestured to the donor wall and praised those who believe in community-led innovation. Cassandra's laugh rippled one final time before she paused, glass raised, surveying her audience with supreme satisfaction. I inhaled quietly, tensing every muscle. Then, with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment privately for months, I stepped forward. Conversations faltered. Necklines dipped as clusters unraveled, forming a corridor between me and the Langford Power couple. The photographer lowered his camera in surprise. I approached Travis, offering a congenial nod. "Congratulations on the gala," I said. "It's spectacular." He blinked, clearly processing that he didn't know my name. Cassandra's eyes narrowed, color draining from her cheeks. The polite applause stalled, replaced by curious murmurs. And at that point, I smiled, just the slightest tilt of the lips, and prepared to speak the truth nobody expected. The moment hung heavy, poised on the brink of recognition. My pulse echoed in my ears as I prepared to claim my place among the names engraved in that donor wall. All it would take was one word. There she was. Cassandra Langford, formerly Cassandra West, had a talent for making any room feel like a stage. And tonight, dressed in a crimson gown that shimmered under the chandeliers like heat rising from a fire, she commanded the ballroom like it had been designed for her alone. I stood near the far wall, mostly in the shadows, watching her move. It wasn't just the way the dress clung to her or the way her hair was styled in perfect waves. It was that aura, that signature laugh that echoed through the space with surgical precision. She laughed like every joke was a standing ovation, like every listener was an adoring fan, and she never once considered that the sound might feel like a dagger to anyone who knew what had beneath it. That laugh used to mean something to me. I used to believe it meant she was happy. With me. With us. With the life we were building. But now, years later, I knew better. Cassandra didn't laugh out of joy. She laughed to be heard. She laughed to remind people she was winning. The pitch of her joy was tuned to the size of her audience. It didn't matter whether the joke was funny or if the moment called for mirth. If eyes were on her, the performance began. I shifted my weight, adjusting the cuff of my blazer, and leaned slightly against the marble column beside me. The event buzzed around her. Jazz band humming in the corner, waiters gliding with trays, photographers snapping endless candid photos. But Cassandra was the centerpiece. She held court in a circle of wealthy donors and local celebrities, smiling as though nothing in her life had ever faltered, as though there were no cracks in the story she told the world. And then, like fate couldn't resist being theatrical, she saw me. Our eyes met across the room, and her reaction was so brief most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I did. Her smile froze for half a second. The glass in her hand trembled just slightly. Then, with expert timing, she masked it with a smirk, the same one she'd worn during our mediation sessions, during the hearing where she fought for half of everything, including credit for a company she'd never built. She tilted her head to the side like I was an unexpected twist in a show she'd already scripted. That smirk held 1,000 layers: amusement, annoyance, and something colder, deeper. The unspoken message was clear: you're not supposed to be here. But she didn't wave me over, didn't acknowledge me with words. No, that wasn't her style. She wanted the audience to wonder who I was first. That was always Cassandra's game. Even back in the early days of our relationship, she needed attention like oxygen. At family dinners, she would tell stories, half-true, well-embellished, always with her as the protagonist. In our company's early meetings, when we were just a fledgling operation operating out of 2 rooms and a shared desk, she was the one volunteering to speak with investors, not because she understood the business, but because she knew how to hold a room. I never begrudged her that. In fact, for a long time, I was grateful for it. Her charm brought us opportunities one couldn't. But that same charm slowly twisted into control, into manipulation. She became addicted to the image of success, not the substance. I remembered our first product launch party. Back when West Dynamics was still nothing more than a beta algorithm, a small group of us celebrated with cheap champagne and overcooked shrimp. Cassandra wore a silver dress that night, less elaborate, more hopeful. She held my hand like we were partners, not characters in 2 different films. But even then, I saw the flicker in her eyes when people asked who she was and what role she played. She answered before I could. I helped him make the boring stuff exciting. That was her way of saying she was the only reason anyone cared. And she always needed someone to play the contrast. The straight man to her performer. The quiet one to her spotlight. That had been me. I took a slow sip of water, letting the coolness anchor me. I had no need to approach her. Not yet. It was better this way, letting her feel the tension rise with each passing second. She would glance my way again, and again, Because Cassandra couldn't ignore what she didn't control. That was her fatal flaw. The music shifted, a cello joining the band with a slow, moody arrangement. Conversations flowed, laughter lifted, and Cassandra leaned into her circle of admirers, dazzling them with a story I could only partially hear. Something about a negotiation with a European firm, peppered with jokes that made her audience erupt in polite chuckles. She gestured elegantly, painting the picture of a woman who navigated power with grace and precision. But I'd been on the other side of that. I knew the chaos that trailed her carefully curated image. She once threw a crystal vase at our living room wall because I told her we couldn't afford another photo shoot for the company newsletter. That was before Travis, of course. Before she found someone more willing to fund her image. I wondered if he knew about her spending habits, about the debt she'd hidden in both our names, about the way she used charm like a blade, cutting down anyone who didn't applaud fast enough. I caught her looking again. This time, the smirk was gone. Her lips pressed into a polite smile as she excused herself from her circle. But she didn't head toward me. She turned her back, heading instead for the main stage where Travis was preparing to give his opening speech. Always on cue. Always center stage. Cassandra never approached unless she had a camera angle in her favor. And I remained where I was, just another +1 in a sea of elegance. But inside, I knew something she didn't. Something the room didn't. I wasn't just an uninvited guest. I was the origin story no one had read. I was the quiet half of the legacy she now claimed as hers. And I was done staying silent. The champagne was cold, crisp, and hollow, just like the words floating through the room. Every clink of glass was another false toast. Every compliment draped over a guest's shoulder felt rehearsed. I stood near one of the marble pillars framing the ballroom, sipping slowly, letting the bubbles fizzle against the back of my throat as Cassandra and Travis began their rounds. They moved like royalty. Travis in a custom tuxedo tailored so sharply it probably cost more than my first car, and Cassandra in that shimmering red dress, her smile honed like a scalpel. The crowd parted for them like the tide for a gilded ark, everyone eager for a word, a handshake, a picture. Cassandra didn't even have to speak to command the space. Her presence did the heavy lifting, and Travis, God bless him, was content playing the proud husband who got lucky. I didn't belong in their story anymore. Not in the version they sold to this room. But the truth was, this room had my fingerprints all over it. The donors, the beneficiaries, the very foundation they were praising tonight, it existed because of the seed funding that came from a deal I made 4 years ago, the kind that didn't make headlines but built empires in silence. Cassandra had twisted the narrative over time, made herself the philanthropist, the visionary. It was easier to rewrite history when the architect steps out of the spotlight. I had once done everything I could to keep her image intact. Now I stood here watching it shine, knowing how much of it was built on omission. The crowd circled the main event, a velvet-covered wall in the center of the room. Travis was all enthusiasm, ushering guests forward with a wink and a joke about revealing the real heroes of the night. Cassandra clung to his side, her hand lightly resting on his forearm, guiding the conversation. When the cloth was finally pulled back, a sleek donor wall was unveiled, black granite polished like obsidian, with rows of gold-plated names engraved into it. Some I recognized. Old clients, former friends, people who had once dismissed me as an errand boy or an operations guy, people who had believed Cassandra's version of our past. And then it happened. Travis, beaming with that rehearsed charisma, pointed to one of the plaques near the top and said loud enough for the entire cluster to hear, "Hope this year we raise more than just paper pushers' salaries." A ripple of laughter followed. The kind that people let out when they don't know what else to do, awkward, performative, slightly too loud. Cassandra didn't miss her cue. She leaned in, feigning humility, and added, like my ex. He worked in admin-filed forms. I guess someone has to do the boring stuff. It wasn't the words that hit. It was the way she said it. Light, breezy, effortless. As if reducing a decade of sacrifice, of night shifts and spreadsheets, of silent back-end strategy, to some office joke was the most natural thing in the world. The laughter this time wasn't just awkward, it was excessive. Too many people were trying too hard. Clutching their champagne glasses, they laughed with open mouths and darting eyes, unsure whether it was cruel or just another punchline to a story they didn't know well enough. I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I'd learned that lesson a long time ago. When someone mocks you, Don't give them a reaction. Let them play their part. Let them assume you're still the version of yourself they walked away from. That's how you win the long game. I caught Maya Tran across the room. She hadn't laughed. Her expression was tight, her lips pursed, eyes flickering between me and Cassandra. She knew. She'd been there in the early days. She had seen what I built while Cassandra chased optics. She gave me a slight nod, almost imperceptible, and then looked away, probably weighing whether to speak up. And then there was Liam Kells, standing near the donor wall with his phone in his hand, not recording, but watching, observing, remembering. Liam was the kind of journalist who didn't waste a headline on gossip. He waited for moments like these, when someone revealed more than they meant to. He didn't laugh either. I let the moment stretch. I stayed planted where I was, swirling the last of the champagne in my glass, letting their ridicule echo in the space between us like smoke. The sound faded slowly, replaced by new chatter and another round of introductions. Travis was too busy soaking up praise to realize he'd just insulted the man who quietly bankrolled half the room. And Cassandra, well, Cassandra never looked back once she felt she had the upper hand. But the thing about upper hands is they depend entirely on perception. Shift the perspective, and everything changes. I stepped away from the pillar, walking slowly around the edge of the gathering, stopping just short of the donor wall. I stared at the gleaming names, reading them one by one, until I reached a blank spot near the top. That blank space had been reserved for anonymous donors, like me. The irony wasn't lost on me. My silence had always been strategic, protective. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, I didn't want anonymity. I wanted acknowledgement, not applause, not a stage, but just a crack in the mask they wore so proudly. I turned slightly, catching Cassandra's profile as she tilted her head back in another laugh. Her eyes scanned the room like a spotlight, looking for affirmation, for jealousy, for power. She didn't see me yet, but she would. I knew the question would come soon. It always did in rooms like this. Eventually, someone would ask who I was. Eventually, the right face would look my way and realize that something didn't quite add up. Cassandra had painted me as a dull footnote in her origin story. But footnotes, when read aloud, have a habit of rewriting the entire chapter. So I waited. And when Travis turned to refill his drink and spotted me, curiosity flickering in his expression, I knew we were minutes away from the shift. The room had been built on lies, but the truth was already walking its way to center stage. I didn't flinch. Not when they laughed. Not when Cassandra delivered that line with the same rehearsed ease she used when testifying during our divorce. You learn, over time, that people mock what they can't measure. That was always her defense mechanism. She couldn't explain me, so she belittled me. Easier that way. Safer. A neat little box labeled admin, so no one would bother to look deeper. But what she forgot, what people like her always forget, is that foundations don't make noise. They hold the structure up while the rest of the house takes credit for standing. Still, it wasn't just about me anymore. That's what made tonight different. Across the room stood Maya Tran, nursing a glass of red wine and watching everything with the wary calculation of someone who'd survived enough boardroom ambushes to sense when a storm was building. She knew me from the beginning, back when West Dynamics was a half-coded dream scrawled across a dozen notepads and sleep-deprived whiteboards. Back when Cassandra used to call my prototypes tech doodles and laughed at the sound of my keystrokes while binging reality shows in the next room. Maya never laughed. She asked questions. She offered edits. She challenged my models. She believed in the math before the results made headlines. Next to her stood Liam Kells, leaning casually against a cocktail table like he wasn't cataloging every word in the room. His phone wasn't in his hand anymore, but I knew better. Liam recorded with his mind before he ever pressed record. He didn't run a gossip column. He wasn't here for fashion or tabloid fodder. Liam Kells only showed up to places where someone was about to be exposed, elevated, or destroyed. The kind of man who smelled the blood in the water before the sharks even arrived. They both knew. They weren't saying anything yet, but they knew. The way Liam kept glancing between me and the donor wall. The way Maya never looked at Cassandra directly, just studied the edges of her, as though confirming a suspicion long held. I could feel the room shifting under its own weight, like the first creak of a chandelier before it crashes. The cue hadn't come yet. The one that would fracture the air and force everyone to pay attention. But it was close. I moved through the edge of the crowd, no longer just a shadow, but not fully in the spotlight either. People turned, Notice me in that vague way you do when someone doesn't fit. Like a face you almost recognize in a dream. A few nodded politely, probably assuming I was someone's date or a consultant they'd forgotten they'd hired. The benefit of never being flashy is that no one suspects you're the person behind the curtain. It's safer that way. Until it isn't. Then it happened. Travis Langford, groomed, charming, rehearsed, turned toward me. His drink had just been refreshed, condensation dripping down the crystal, and he looked genuinely relaxed for a man who had just belittled someone publicly. Maybe he thought he was still riding the high of the donor wall applause. Or maybe he was the kind of guy who genuinely didn't remember the people he insulted. Either way, he smiled. A real, curious smile. No malice in it. Just that cocktail party charm that smooths over ignorance. So, Graham, what is it you do now? Simple. Innocent. Delivered like it was an olive branch. But he had no idea. Cassandra, beside him, had frozen, just for a fraction of a second. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She didn't turn her head toward me, not fully, but her body stilled in that way a deer does when it hears a twig snap in the woods. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know what shape it would take. I didn't answer immediately. Let the silence stretch, just long enough to be noticed. I glanced around. The circle was smaller now. Conversations near us had paused, waiting. Ears perked. Smiles dimmed. What is it you do now? I thought about the hours I used to spend at our kitchen table, poring over line items while she texted friends about wine tastings. About the nights I sat in bed reading journal articles on AI development while she watched romantic comedies with the volume too loud. About how, when I signed our divorce papers, she scoffed and said, "Good luck turning spreadsheets into anything that matters." Now here we were. I met Travis's gaze. "I'm the founder," I said simply. Calm. Clear. A single word. But it hit like a drop of ink in a glass of water, spreading quietly, unstoppably. Travis blinked. Founder. That was the crack. Just a hairline fracture in the surface. I didn't need to hammer it open. The room would do that for me. Cassandra finally looked at me. Not with confidence now, but calculation. She was searching my face for the end of the sentence. Founder of what? What game was I playing? And that's when Liam stepped forward, casual as ever, but with that glint in his eyes, the kind that meant a story had just walked into his lap. "You're Graham West," he said, already pulling out his phone. The Graham West. Founder of West Dynamics. The AI company that just inked the defense contract. Gasps. Audible ones. Cassandra's color drained like a slow leak from a cracked vase. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Travis's eyes flicked from Liam to me, then back to Cassandra, confusion blooming into something sharper. "You're that West," Travis said, his voice a little thinner now. And I nodded. Just once. I didn't need to say anything else. Because that was the cue. The room was no longer theirs. It was mine. One word. That's all it took. I looked at Travis, then at Cassandra, and let it roll out with the calm clarity of someone who no longer needed permission to exist. Founder. It didn't shout. It didn't boast. It simply stood there between us, anchoring the air. And in the seconds that followed, the sound of it unraveled everything. Laughter didn't just stop, it collapsed. Like a tint yanked from its center pole. Forks froze halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. The hum of the room thinned until you could practically hear the band stall, unsure if they'd missed a cue or if something bigger had just detonated. I watched the realization start to spread. First to Travis, then to the people behind him, and then finally to Cassandra, whose mouth had opened slightly in confusion. Founder of what? Someone near the bar muttered. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because Liam Kell stepped forward before I could even draw another breath. He raised his phone like it was a torch and spoke louder than necessary, clearly enjoying the moment. You're Graham West, he said. The Graham West? West Dynamics? The AI company that just inked the defense contract. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a reveal. Like he'd been sitting on this knowledge all night, waiting for the moment Cassandra's house of cards would finally tremble. And now he had his headline. Someone gasped. Another voice, too loud, repeated. Wait. What? Maya Tran appeared at Liam's side. Her eyebrows lifted like she'd just watched a magician saw through a lie and pull out the truth instead. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to either. Her eyes were locked on Cassandra's face. I turned my head and watched her. Cassandra, still holding that champagne flute, now trembling slightly in her hand. Her face, always so tightly composed, was blank. Not furious, not embarrassed. Just stunned. Like someone who'd misread a familiar book and only just now realized the ending was never what they thought. Travis took a step back from me, then looked toward Cassandra for guidance like a man who had just walked into the wrong room at a party he was supposed to host. "Cassandra," he said under his breath, "is this the same?" But she didn't answer. She was still staring at me, and I could see the past catching up to her in real time. Her memories were rewriting themselves. The spreadsheets she mocked, the server bills I paid for with my own savings, the weekends I disappeared into code while she drank sangria by the pool. All the times she dismissed my vision as a fantasy. They were no longer things to be forgotten or joked about. They were proof. Unshakable. Unavoidable. I stepped toward the donor wall, not to draw attention to myself, but because I needed a place to put my glass. The champagne had gone warm, but it was still bubbling. That felt ironic. People began whispering. All around me. About me. They were piecing it together now. Why the name West had felt familiar. Why Maya had gone quiet earlier. Why Liam hadn't laughed at the paper pusher joke. The people who'd laughed hardest were now the ones glancing at the exits or pretending to be busy on their phones. One woman near Cassandra touched her arm gently and said, "You didn't mention that was your ex." She didn't respond. She just blinked, still frozen. And that was the part that struck me the most. Because Cassandra had always been quick, witty, ruthless when cornered. But tonight, with a single word, I had taken away the one thing she'd always relied on: control. Travis was the first to try and recover. He cleared his throat, straightened his jacket, and offered me a hand. "Well," he said, smiling too wide, "you've certainly made this event more interesting." I had no idea. Most people don't. I replied, shaking his hand briefly. "That's kind of the point." He chuckled awkwardly and stepped aside. Maya approached then. "You've still got timing," she whispered, not unkindly. "I didn't plan this," I said. "Doesn't mean it wasn't perfect." I glanced at Liam, who was already tapping away at his phone like he was framing the lead paragraph in his head. Cassandra caught the movement and finally spoke. "Liam," she said, her voice hoarse, "this isn't a story." He didn't even look up. "Everything's a story, Cassandra. Some people just don't realize when they're in one." I watched as the last of her pride deflated. Not dramatically. Not with tears or shouting. Just a slow, quiet unraveling. Her hand lowered, the glass still full. Her lips pressed together. Her eyes searched for a corner to escape to. And still, I said nothing. Because the truth didn't need dressing up tonight. It didn't need to be loud. It just needed to stand still long enough to be seen. And for once, I let it speak without interference. The man they'd labeled just admin was the man they'd read about in Forbes. The man she left for being too small had become someone they now studied in case reports. I wasn't a twist in her story. I was the story. One word had done what years of defending myself never could. Found her. And this room would never forget it. Now they were listening. The same people who had politely ignored me for the first hour of the gala were suddenly tracking my every move. Faces that had blurred together in the noise were now turned, eyes focused, mouths slightly parted as they recalibrated everything they thought they knew. I didn't have to say another word. The silence between us was doing the work. Cassandra turned ghost white. Her hands, always so poised, clutched her champagne flute with too much pressure. I noticed her thumb trembling against the glass. She didn't speak, maybe couldn't. I wondered if she was remembering the last time we spoke face to face. She had looked across the mediation table and told me with a clipped smile that I lacked scale, that I didn't think big enough for the life she envisioned. Those words had followed me like a ghost, whispering in boardrooms and conference calls, pushing me through 18-hour coding days and into the first deal that bought me a second chance. Now here she was, watching her old conclusion crack apart like cheap glass under the weight of the truth. And Travis? He let out a low whistle, trying to play it off like admiration. "Wait, you're that West?" I nodded once. No need to embellish. Let the room do the rest. Behind him, the ballroom shifted. Conversations had turned. I could see pockets of people gesturing toward me, whispering names to one another, checking their phones under the tablecloths to pull up headlines and bios. West Dynamics, a quiet rise in military AI. Graham West's disruptive model changes national defense contracting. The internet had a longer memory than Cassandra did. Then Maya stepped forward, her expression somewhere between vindication and curiosity. Didn't you speak at the World Innovation Forum last quarter? She asked, as if she didn't already know the answer. I did, I said calmly. On the ethics of neural prediction systems. That was it. That was the moment the shift finalized. The tables turned, so quickly it almost made me lightheaded. The questions kept coming, and I answered them all, slowly, thoughtfully, like I wasn't just part of the room but owned part of its foundation. Which I did, quite literally. They just hadn't noticed. A waitress passed by, offering more champagne. Cassandra flinched when the tray nudged her elbow, and a few drops from her glass spilled onto the carpet. She didn't even notice. She was too busy staring at me, her lips slightly parted, as if trying to rewind the last 10 minutes in her head and come up with an alternate ending. I almost pitied her in that moment, but then I remembered the dinners where she sighed while I explained system architecture. The jokes she made about my coding notes to her friends. How she once laughed during an argument and said, "Graham, I didn't marry potential, I married convenience." There was nothing convenient about me now. Travis was quieter now, hands in his pockets, the weight of Cassandra's omission settling around his shoulders. His posture stiffened every time someone leaned in to ask about me. He kept glancing between us like he was suddenly trying to calculate how much of his wife's empire had been built on someone else's back. Liam had drifted off, but not far. He stood near the edge of the crowd, watching. His phone was back in his hand, and he wasn't even pretending to scroll casually anymore. He was already writing, and Cassandra, finally realizing the oxygen had left her side of the room, stepped forward. "Graham," she said, voice soft, too soft for her usual theatrics. "Why didn't you?" But I cut her off gently. "Say something sooner?" I tilted my head. "You never asked." It was a simple truth, delivered without venom. And that was what made it sting. I could see her searching for a way back into control, but the usual tools weren't working. She couldn't charm her way out of this. Couldn't joke it away. The smile she attempted flickered and faded. The room wasn't rallying to her anymore. It was observing her, measuring her. I stepped closer to the donor wall and gestured toward one of the blank spaces at the top. No name, no plaque. Just clean, untouched black granite. "I donated anonymously months ago," I said, turning slightly so my voice carried. The crowd murmured again. Someone clapped. Another offered a quiet wow. Travis blinked, lips pressed tightly together now. Cassandra looked like she wanted to vanish into the velvet beneath her heels. I wasn't here to humiliate anyone. That's the part no one ever understands about moments like this. It's not about revenge. It's not about payback. It's about revelation. People like Cassandra only thrive in curated narratives, stories where they're the heroine, where the discarded partner was just a chapter best left unspoken. But tonight, her story had a new epilogue. The man she once mocked was the man whose name now floated through the crowd like royalty. And he wasn't laughing. He was just present. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply answered questions when they came, spoke truth when it was asked of me, let the room recalibrate around a reality that had been hidden behind someone else's fiction. Eventually, people drifted toward me, asking for cards, offering to connect over breakfast meetings or keynote opportunities. I smiled politely, accepted their offers without committing to anything. Not out of arrogance, but because tonight wasn't about building something new. Tonight was about closing the circle. I caught Maya's eye once more before the room began to settle. She raised her glass slightly. I returned the gesture. No words passed between us, but her nod said everything. Well played. The night moved on. Music resumed. Servers adjusted their paths. The world kept spinning. But I knew, they knew, that it wouldn't spin quite the same for Cassandra anymore. And that was enough. Rewriting history is easy when the other person stays silent. Cassandra had always counted on that. She'd spent years perfecting her version of our story. How she lifted me, inspired me, pushed me. How I was just some sweet, dependable guy she outgrew once she found her purpose. That's what she told people. Over wine. At brunch. During interviews for magazine spreads where she wore blazers 2 sizes too tight and spoke about grit and reinvention. But I remember the real story. I met Cassandra when I was a back-end operations analyst working 80-hour weeks at a logistics firm with flickering lights and stale breakroom coffee. She was temping in marketing, already dreaming of bigger things. She loved the idea of ambition, so long as it glittered on the surface. She used to joke that spreadsheets gave her hives. I didn't mind. I thought opposites balanced each other. She brought color, and I brought structure. I built the systems, and she made them look good. That was our rhythm in the early days. I was also building something else then, something no one saw. West Dynamics wasn't a company yet. It was a Google Doc. Then it was an algorithm scrawled across 100 sticky notes and the backs of receipts. I coded late at night after work, my eyes dry from staring at screens too long. She would walk past the guest room, where I'd set up a makeshift desk, and roll her eyes. "Another night playing Robot Whisper," she'd say. I laughed it off. I always did. She used to call my vision a fantasy in PowerPoint. Whenever I tried to show her progress, she'd give me 5 minutes, no more, and then change the subject to a show she was watching or something a coworker had said that day. If the conversation wasn't about her, she lost interest. But I didn't hold it against her then. I thought she needed time. I thought she'd understand once I could show results. The funding didn't come quickly. I worked 2 jobs. I borrowed from friends I haven't spoken to since. When I finally landed our first client, a transportation firm in Phoenix that wanted to test my predictive routing model, I remember running into the bedroom like a kid holding up a trophy. I told her we had a shot, that this could work. She stared at me from the vanity mirror, brushing her hair. "Graham," she said, "that's cute. But one client isn't a business. It's a fluke." I swallowed that, like I swallowed everything. Eventually, I stopped showing her the updates. When I brought on a partner, she didn't even ask who. When I hit a 6-figure milestone in revenue, she was too busy planning a trip to Tulum with her friends. She didn't ask where the extra money came from. She just assumed the raise at my day job had kicked in. She didn't want to know. When she met Travis, she told me she felt seen, that he understood the world she wanted to build. What she meant was, he had a penthouse and spoke in elevator pitches. He didn't talk about code. He didn't stay up all night reading white papers. He had a watch collection and knew how to pronounce Pomerol at wine tastings. The day she served me papers, she didn't cry. She wore heels and a blazer and told me it was time to separate gracefully. Her lawyer was waiting in the car. She took what she could. The apartment, the decor, half of the accounts, minus the one I'd been smart enough to keep hidden. She left with a smirk and a whisper, "I hope you figure out what you want to be, Graham." She never asked what I already was. While she was moving in with Travis and turning her name into a brand, I was finalizing the prototype that would land us our second contract, and then the 5th, and then the one that caught the eye of the defense sector. She didn't know about the NDA I signed with the federal government. She didn't know about the team I built across 3 time zones. She didn't know I had spoken at MIT, at the World Innovation Forum, at the Roundtable in Geneva. Because by then, I had stopped trying to prove anything. But that didn't mean I forgot. I remembered every insult she whispered under her breath, every laugh she shared with friends at my expense, every time she introduced me to someone as her sweet husband instead of her partner. And the irony is, if she had waited just a little longer, she would have had everything she wanted. She could have been standing next to me in press photos, wearing that red dress at a product launch instead of at a gala funded by someone else's name. But she wanted flash before foundation. So she chose the man with the penthouse over the man with the plan. And now, all these years later, she stood in a ballroom surrounded by my architecture, my funding, my vision, my reputation, thinking it was hers. And for a while, maybe it was. But nights like this have a funny way of pulling back the curtain. The room was different now. The story had shifted. They weren't just looking at her anymore. They were looking at me. And not as the man who was once married to Cassandra Langford, but as the man who had quietly become someone without needing her approval. The real history had been written in silence, in sweat, in code, and now it was finally being read out loud. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't tilt my glass or skim the room for applause like Cassandra would have. I simply stood there, answering the questions they finally decided I was worthy of asking. That's the difference between Cassandra and me. She needed the moment to feel important. I let the moment find me. Travis was still recovering, standing a little stiff now, his rehearsed charm cracking at the edges. When one of the foundation's advisors leaned in to ask him if he'd known about my involvement, he muttered something vague and coughed into his fist like the question had caught in his throat. Cassandra hadn't spoken again. She hovered nearby, her posture perfect as ever, but her movements jerky, delayed, like a machine built for performance suddenly receiving the wrong programming. The ripple of attention hadn't faded. In fact, it was circling back stronger. Someone approached and asked if I'd be open to consulting on an education initiative. Another offered their card and mentioned a mutual connection on the board of a global tech summit. I gave polite responses, took the cards, and kept my tone measured, careful. Let them come to their own conclusions. The more I said, the less I needed to say. That's when someone from the foundation committee stepped forward. Middle-aged, polished, slightly flushed from wine or embarrassment or both. He asked if I might be interested in formally aligning West Dynamics with the foundation's mission, something official, something on the record. The kind of strategic partnership they'd likely been hoping Travis could secure. I let the question hang in the air. Then I said it. I already did. Anonymously. Months ago. It was a quiet sentence said without flair. But it hit like a cymbal clash in a silent room. Travis's jaw tensed so hard I could hear his teeth grit. Cassandra blinked fast. She stepped forward, as if to confirm whether she'd heard me right. You donated? I turned to her slowly. I believed in the cause. Even if I didn't believe in the people running it. A few guests shifted where they stood, their expressions flickering between discomfort and awe. Someone stifled a laugh. Cassandra's mouth opened like she had a retort waiting, some scathing line that would put things back in her favor, but nothing came. There was no script for this moment. No recovery protocol for being publicly unmasked while standing in front of a wall you thought honored your own empire, only to learn it had been built with bricks someone else laid. She stepped closer, her voice lowered, almost intimate. Why didn't you tell me? That night you ran into me at the firm. You didn't say anything. Would it have mattered? I asked. She hesitated. I didn't know. You never asked. That seemed to land harder than anything else. Because it was true. She hadn't asked. Not during our marriage. Not during the divorce. Not in the years since. Cassandra only looked backward when it served her narrative. And my story, quiet, methodical, unglamorous, had never served her. It wasn't revenge, I added after a moment. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. She looked at me like she was trying to decide if I meant that. But I did. I hadn't come here to destroy her. If anything, I came here to make peace with the truth. To stop hiding. To step into a room she once told me I'd never belong in and do so without shrinking. And now that I had, there was no going back. A young reporter with a press pass approached us, clearly sensing tension. Mr. West, she said, flipping open a leather notebook, would you be open to an interview this week? A piece on your philanthropic direction? I nodded, happy to chat. I'll have my assistant reach out. I could feel Cassandra beside me shrink by inches. She turned to Travis, maybe looking for rescue. But he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, calculating. His face was calm, but his eyes were furious. I'd seen that look before, on men who realized the deal they thought they'd negotiated came with hidden terms. I gave him a small nod. Not a threat, not a challenge, just an acknowledgement that the game had changed. I stepped back, giving the crowd space to swallow the shift. It wasn't about me owning the room. It was about me no longer being invisible in it. The rest of the evening unfolded in fragments. Cassandra stayed, but quieter now. She smiled for photos, but her eyes didn't follow the lens. Travis gave a short speech toward the end, thanking donors again, this time omitting the earlier joke about paper pushers. The donor wall gleamed behind him like a confession, and no one dared pretend they didn't know who funded the event anymore. Later, as guests began filtering out, a few shook my hand and spoke with that exaggerated politeness people reserve for someone they've clearly misjudged. I didn't hold it against them. That was Cassandra's world. Curated stories, filtered truths, and a hierarchy built on perception. As I waited for the valet to bring my car around, Cassandra appeared at the coat check. Alone. No photographers. No admirers. Just her and the weight of everything she didn't know. She approached, her arms crossed, her voice low. You should have told me, she said. I tilted my head. Told you what? That I turned out okay without your belief. She looked down, maybe ashamed, maybe still figuring out what part of her carefully constructed story had actually been real. I helped her into her coat, out of reflex more than anything. She stiffened, then relaxed. You embarrassed me, she said quietly. No, I replied, buttoning my coat. I just existed. I walked away before she could respond, because this wasn't about her anymore. It never really was. The last laugh wasn't a laugh at all. It was a calm breath, a truth laid bare. A room full of witnesses who now saw what she had refused to for years. I didn't need applause. Or revenge. I had something better. I had peace. Later that night, After the ballroom had thinned and the music had softened into a distant hum, I found myself alone by the coat check. The staff moved like quiet ghosts behind the counter, retrieving jackets with practiced hands and polite nods. My hands were tucked into my pockets, fingers brushing the valet stub, but I wasn't thinking about the car. I was thinking about the look on Cassandra's face, that split second of exposed silence when she realized the audience she'd always played to had turned, that she had performed the wrong script for the wrong crowd. And still, despite everything, I didn't hate her. She believed in the version of me that was convenient for her. And when that version didn't serve her narrative anymore, she left it behind like a dress that didn't fit. But hate? No. What I felt was heavier and quieter. A kind of mourning for what never had the chance to be honest. The click of heels echoed behind me, deliberate and hesitant all at once. "Graham," she said. I didn't turn immediately. Just let the sound of her voice settle. It was the same voice that once whispered late-night plans into my ear. The same voice that had once asked me if I thought we'd grow old together. Now it carried none of that warmth. Only the brittle tone of someone unsure if they're allowed to speak. I turned to face her. She stood there in a long gray coat that swallowed the red of her gown. Her makeup, once flawless, had faded slightly, lipstick worn thin at the corners, mascara smudged subtly under one eye. But her posture was intact, shoulders squared like she still had something left to defend. "You should have told me," she said again, softer this time. I raised an eyebrow. "Told you what?" She shifted. "That you were doing all that. West Dynamics. The contracts. The success." I almost laughed. "Almost. You didn't want to know," I replied. "Back then, you weren't asking. You were walking out." Her mouth opened and closed once, like a glitch in her confidence. "That's not fair, isn't it?" I said. "I remember you looking at me over dinner, calling my work boring admin stuff. I remember the night I showed you the prototype. You said it was cute, then left to meet your friends. And when I told you I needed more time, just a few more months, you said, 'I need a man who moves people, not paper.' So you moved on." She swallowed hard. "I thought you were stuck. Like you'd given up." "No," I said, calm and firm. "I was building something. You just didn't wait long enough to see it take shape." She didn't argue. Not this time. She just looked away, toward the glass doors that still shimmered faintly with reflections from the ballroom chandeliers. She started, then paused. "I didn't think it would hurt like this." I tilted my head. "Hurt? Seeing you there," she said, "in the center of it all. Owning the room. And me, standing beside people who were laughing at you minutes before. They looked at me like I was small. Like I missed something obvious." I stepped closer, not in anger, but so she could hear me without the world listening. "You didn't miss it," I said. "You dismissed it." There it was. The flinch. She drew in a breath, then looked me dead in the eyes. "Do you want me to say I'm sorry?" The question hung there. A fragile offering. I studied her face. Cassandra Langford, who had always known what to say, how to spin it, how to land on her feet. But tonight, she looked lost. Not humiliated. Just lost. Like she'd walked through the mirror and realized the reflection no longer followed. I could have asked her to say it. Could have demanded it. Could have listed every insult, every moment of doubt, every time she chose image over partnership. I could have made her speak the apology I'd wanted for years. But I didn't. Because the truth is, there are some apologies that don't need to be spoken to be heard, and others that wouldn't matter even if they were. "I don't need an apology," I said. She blinked. "You don't?" "No." I paused. "Because if you gave me one now, it would only be to feel better. Not to make anything right." Her expression shifted, somewhere between wounded and understanding. She nodded slowly, looking down at the floor. "You embarrassed me," she whispered. "No," I said gently. "I just existed." She looked up, and this time, she really saw me. Not the version of me that wore khakis and stayed quiet in meetings. Not the man she told herself she outgrew. But the one who stood in a room full of power and didn't need to raise his voice to change the energy. The silence between us stretched again. "Finally," she said, "Travis is furious." I smiled faintly. He should be. He threw a party and didn't know the biggest donor was standing across the room from him. I didn't mean for any of that to happen. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." She opened her mouth again. Maybe to explain, maybe to salvage the last piece of whatever she thought still existed between us. But I shook my head. "You made your choices, Cassandra. I made mine." She stared at me for a long time, then nodded. "Good night, Graham. Good night." She walked away slowly, her heels echoing again, fainter with every step. I stepped outside, letting the cold night air bite against my skin. My car pulled up, headlights cutting through the quiet. As I slid into the back seat, I looked one last time through the glass doors. Cassandra stood just inside, framed by crystal light. Her face turned toward the room like she was trying to make sense of what it had all meant. She wouldn't figure it out tonight. Maybe not ever. And that was fine. The apology never came, and I no longer needed it. The next morning, my name was trending. Not because I gave a speech. Not because I called attention to myself or demanded a stage. No, all I did was exist, quietly, calmly, in a room where people had already decided what I was worth. And that, apparently, was enough. The sound bites came not from me, but from those who had stood nearby, who heard Cassandra's jokes before the reveal. Quotes surfaced, clipped from casual conversations where I'd been called boring, admin, forgettable. Now, juxtaposed with my name and credentials, they read like confessions. The same people who laughed were scrambling to revise their statements. A few tried to paint it all as misunderstanding, as harmless ribbing. But the truth doesn't bend well, especially when it's been silent for too long. I sat by my apartment window with a cup of black coffee, watching the city pulse beneath the glass. My inbox was overflowing, requests for interviews, invitations to sit on panels, even a television producer asking if I'd consider a segment on unexpected tech founders. It would have been easy to say yes, to step into the spotlight and let it finally warm the skin I'd kept in the shadows for years. But I didn't. Some moments don't need to be cashed in. They just need to be remembered. I declined the interviews. All of them. I didn't need the world to know what happened in that ballroom. Not from me. Enough people had already seen it. Enough eyes had been opened. The people who mattered knew. And the ones who didn't? They never did. There was a message from a global firm, one Travis had been courting for months. They'd seen the press. They knew about West Dynamics, of course. They didn't realize, until now, that it was me. That the man their target had tried to leverage was actually the person behind the contract. They asked if I'd be willing to consider a partnership. I replied with 2 words, not interested. Because winning doesn't always mean taking the prize. Sometimes it means knowing you could have. And walking away, Cassandra didn't reach out. Not directly. But I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she was in damage control mode. That she'd canceled a podcast appearance. That she'd asked the foundation not to post any photos from the event. I imagined her sitting in her pristine kitchen, skimming articles with trembling hands, trying to recalibrate her story. But this time, the story wasn't hers to tell. That night had never been about revenge. I didn't go there with a plan to humiliate her. I just wanted to see what she'd built, what she'd turned our shared work into. And maybe, quietly, I wanted her to see me. Not the version she discarded, but the man I'd become. The man I always was. And she did. In every flicker of her eyes, in every stammered sentence and silence that stretched too long, I saw it. Recognition, regret, and something else. Not quite envy, but proximity to something she no longer had access to. Power, maybe. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you don't need to prove anything anymore. The kind that's earned, not declared. People always talk about the best revenge being success. But I've learned that's only partly true. The best revenge isn't success, it's indifference. It's showing up without needing to steal the show. It's letting the truth do what time couldn't. And then walking away without needing applause. I took a long sip of coffee and looked over at the old framed blueprint on the wall, version 1.0 of the algorithm that started it all. Scribbled margins, coffee stains, a folded crease down the center where I once stuffed it into a manila folder and pitched it to a room that wasn't ready. Cassandra had rolled her eyes at that blueprint once, said, "It looks like math class threw up on paper." Funny. That same document had now built systems used across 2 continents and funded educational grants for girls in robotics. It had secured jobs for veterans in cybersecurity. It had, in one way or another, changed lives. And it almost never existed. Because someone I loved couldn't see it for what it was. Couldn't see me. Now, the city outside kept humming. Offers kept coming. Doors kept opening. But I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I wasn't running to prove her wrong. I had already done that by simply staying true to the one person she never really got to know. Myself. And as I sat there, letting the sunlight spill through the window, warming the room. I built on quiet decisions and long nights. I smiled. Not because I won, but because I never needed to play their game in the first place. Sometimes, the best ending isn't dramatic. It's peaceful. It's quiet. It's knowing that you walked into a room you weren't supposed to belong in and left owning it without ever raising your voice.